Is worship on earth as it is in heaven. Basically, what we're going to do is, this first paper, going to open up the issue of what is worship. Take us right back, I think, to something fairly foundational and fundamental. And then the slight change to explain for Jackie is the second session this evening is, rather than having another session directly with me, we've invited 4 brothers who've got a very different approach to worship, particularly worship on the Lord's Day. And we're encouraging them to talk and to share with us why they do what they do. And hopefully we can open it up for general discussion. And then the third paper I'm going to bring tomorrow, really I want to just try and encourage you in that paper as much as I can, and maybe in some ways expand our vision a little bit. I'm very grateful. I've had a lot of advice in giving this paper. I better come clean a bit. I think this is really sensible. Good. This is good strategy, really, because if this turns out to be a turkey, it's not entirely me to blame. So I'm very, very grateful for the terrific input which I've received from Mike Plant, Bill Dyer, and Ian Densham. The more I prepared this, the more it felt a bit like a hospital pass. But it is a controversial area, worship, and I am actually going to try and be fairly provocative this afternoon. So after we've looked at what I want to take you to are 4 observations on worship, one of which I think is very, very much neglected today. But I hope after we've done that, we'll have some time for interaction and for some discussion. So I really am trying to provoke you this afternoon, hopefully in a constructive way. I want to begin by making some basic observations and identifying some of my terms. When we're talking about worship, I'm thinking in particular of what we might call corporate or congregational worship. Now, I appreciate that isn't the Bible's exclusive definition of worship, and I will be giving some attention to that towards the end of this address. But primarily, I'm thinking of corporate and congregational worship when we come together. I think the second thing I want to say right at the beginning is that we need to recognize that there have been huge changes in the area of worship. You might say the worship landscape, particularly, I think, since the late 1950s. We're all very familiar, sadly, probably for the wrong reasons, with the term worship wars. And indeed, some of us may be casualties of some of those experiences that we've had along the way. One of the fascinating things that I think we see today is that churches are increasingly, as I say, probably more in this, I think, from the 70s onwards, have been defined, particularly in terms of whether they are contemporary or traditional, or if you use another kind of parameter, contemporary or historical. I think previously the great distinction was whether we followed a kind of liturgical form in worship or whether we were free. But now, increasingly, with the way in which churches are defined is whether they are contemporary or traditional. I think that is something new. And it's an indicator, again, of the very great upheavals there have been in this area of worship. Old certainties have changed. I'm actually old enough to remember a time where if you went away on holiday, or you left the church which you regularly worshipped and went to another church somewhere else, you pretty well knew what was going to happen in that service. You probably were familiar with the hymn book. There was just a few hymn books that were used. Folks were familiar with them. Now, things are much more uncertain. There is huge change, and many of these developments are very, very positive, but it's an indicator, again, of this change. So, another observation I want to make, really the last one at the beginning here, is to remind us, of course, that God in his providence places us in a particular culture. He has always done that with his people. And there is a sense, as much as we may long to be lost in wonder, love and praise as we worship God, and that may be our aspiration, I trust it is, we are nevertheless still creatures grounded in a particular culture. We're very much people of space and time. Now, I think there's an important tension that exists here that's often overlooked, and I think if we overlook it, it's sometimes the cause of great pain. And the tensions between these two things. Firstly, worship is a response to the timeless, eternal nature of God. So as we worship, in whichever way we may worship, there is something that connects us throughout history with all of God's people, and indeed connects us with what's going on in heaven right now. That's a very wonderful thing. And we're able to say that because of the clear objectivity of certain aspects of worship. The nature of God, the character of God, the invitation to worship him in spirit and in truth. The principles that drive worship, in other words, are fixed. But the opposite side of the tension is that our worship inevitably takes place within a particular culture. And each culture presents particular challenges to worship and opportunities for worship. I mean, the obvious example here is that we would have to believe that first century worship under Roman domination will look rather different to 21st century worship in a democracy. There are obvious differences of constraint and context. And into this we need to factor the fact that language and approaches to learning change as times change and cultures change. Time and availability of people changes. Well, probably one of the really big challenges that you may face in your church is the change in work patterns amongst many of your folks. Years ago, it was possible to have a fairly fixed position that most people mostly it would be men who were working. Mostly they worked 9 to 5, 8 to 4, and they worked 5 days a week. That was pretty fixed. I had one or two doing shift patterns, that was a little bit unusual, but that was the general fixed pattern. Today things are hugely different. And they're different because it's the reality of the culture that we live in. Similarly, again, I think we can add to cultural differences things like concentration abilities, ethnic differences. All of this has an influence on the way in which we approach the area of worship. Now, I'm flagging this up at the beginning because sometimes the assumption is amongst some church leaders that the way we worship is the way Christians have always worshipped, and certainly all Christians should worship. Historically, that falls down very quickly. For example, we no longer baptize converts naked and at sunrise, which apparently they did. Hippolytus, writing in the apostolic tradition, references that that was the common practice amongst Christians. So failing to observe this tension between the timeless eternal nature of God and the fact that we're in a culture that is shifting and changing, if we don't observe there is a tension here, we may very rapidly find ourselves in considerable pain. Now, what I'm wanting to do really is take you right back to basics. I mean, it's such a massive area, worship, and there is so much that's been written and so much that we could look at this afternoon. I thought, in all honesty, perhaps what is the best thing or most helpful for our discussion is to come back to really defining, looking at, in detail at some sort of definition of worship. And in doing this, I'm going to go for 4 areas. The first, in many ways, is to prefix everything from today, this afternoon, this evening, and tomorrow morning. The observation simply that worship is all about God. I think that's a great starting point for us and a very important one. Now, having done that, I want to move to a second area, which I think is hugely neglected and often mishandled by us. And I want to do this by looking at the worship in terms of it being the worship of the whole person. And the area of neglect that we're going to look at there is the area of human emotions. And then I want us to look at worship being the whole congregation, some practical implications from that. And lastly, the whole of life. Well, the first one in terms of worship is all about God. It's crucial that we start here. It's where the Bible starts us. It's the great focus of biblical principles, and it's vital for our discussion. We come to worship God as Father, Son, and Spirit. Christian worship, of course, has to be Trinitarian. Hubert Carson Herbert Carlson, writing in his book, Hallelujah. It's a great book on worship if you can get hold of a copy of that. EP used to publish it. I'm not sure if it's still in print. But at the beginning of that book, he defines worship as the declaration by a creature of the greatness of his creator, the glad affirmation of the forgiven sinner, of the mercy of his Redeemer. Now, the emphasis is not on the worshipper, though the worshipper, of course, is part of the equation, but the emphasis in that definition is on the greatness of the Creator and the mercy of the Redeemer. Now, this is really obvious. This is terribly obvious. At least I hope it is to you. And in many ways, it seems very straightforward, because the reality is, in church life, it is very easy for other things to crowd in on us and suppress this unique focus on God. In fact, I think in terms of our leading of worship and our approach to worship in churches, the great fundamental challenge that we have is to see that this focus, that it is all about God, is sustained and maintained. Now, again, within this there is a tension, and the tension exists between worship, if you like, is to do God good, it's to bring glory to his name. But at the same time, of course, worship is to do us good. It's to inform, it's to encourage, refresh, and support us. Now, the big question I wrestle with as I approach worship in the church that I pastor, and I think about this regularly, is I find myself asking, as we look at what we're doing, who matters most here? I think it's a really important diagnostic question. Who matters most here? Who is this really about? I want you to picture a church in your mind. Imaginary village, an imaginary town or something like that. For me, it's, I know, a little congregational church up a side street in Aberflyarth, something like that. And as I look out on the congregation, you see a collection of different people. I want to engage your imagination. I know you've had a long journey, so try and come with me, all right? In the congregation, there is Mrs. G, and she loves to play the organ. So she will. Pastor T, when he preaches, loves to present sermons that are full of stories and to quote from really big books. So he will. Deacon B loves to crack a joke every time in the notices. So he will. And Mr. D loves to look terribly serious throughout the service. And he will. And then, of course, there's X, Y, and Z, who all love to sit where they've always sat, so they certainly will. Now, the effect of that approach is that quite probably that little church is a lovely, safe place. It's a place where everyone is content to be part of what they want to be part of. They have their roles, they're content in those roles, and they pursue them with great energy. And in this lovely, safe place, God's praise is sung, people pray, and they probably are well taught. But the reality is that there can be something foundational and fundamental to Christian worship that is completely absent. You're probably familiar with John Piper's book, The Supremacy of God in Preaching. If you're not, I really encourage you to read it. It's probably one of the best books on preaching ever written. And in that, he makes the observation that people are starving for the grandeur of God, and the vast majority don't know it. That's his diagnosis. And so I wonder if in that same congregation we might find some other people. For example, P has finally made it to church. Is facing a week of extremely long hours, will have no more contact with the church during that week. It's going to be entirely impossible for her. This is her one shot for encouragement and support and spiritual refreshment. W has finally got a husband to church. He thinks the whole thing is lame, but he's willing to give it a go. And he's there. And then there's F, who struggles to sustain the interest of a rebelling teenage daughter who's glued to her iPhone. And she's losing the battle. And then there's a sprinkling of others. We'll call them A, B, and C. And this is the youth group who've come back as keen as anything from camp, but are beginning to become restless and disappointed. it's very easy to lose the tension between worshipping God and focusing on God, or using worship as a means to meet our own needs. I'm sure lots of us have had the very painful experience of people coming to see us and saying, well, Pastor, I think God is moving us on. I met a woman like this yesterday, actually. I had the privilege, I was preaching yesterday morning in a large apostolic church, and it was very interesting, it was very appropriate to this. Really challenged me in a lot of what I was thinking about in a very healthy way. And when I got in, I met a couple who, they used to worship with us many, many years ago, and I remember the conversation. Well, we feel we've been here, and we feel God is moving us on. And when you scrape under the surface of that and you dig a bit, you find the real reason. And the real reason is, well, my gifts are not being recognised. This lady had been a very engaged pub performer, singer. She'd go around lots of pubs. She had a very nice singing voice, but wanted a platform in the church. So it's fascinating for me yesterday, being in this church, meeting them, and they basically were saying the same thing to me about this church that they're in. There is this continual attitude, isn't there, amongst some people that worship becomes a platform for my self-expression. And there is a tension there that we battle with. Now, I think one of the reasons for this is that we're part of a culture which, within its almost comprehensive rejection of God, I don't know about you, but when I look at our culture today, I think of Psalm 2, kings of the earth take their stand, the rulers gather together against the Lord and his anointed one. Let us break their chains, throw off their fetters. That's our culture today. And as Romans 1 tells us, instead of the worship of the Creator, there becomes the worship of created things. And in particular in our culture, it's the worship of self. And these are supported by the false doctrines, really, of self-esteem and self-expression. Our culture is becoming increasingly more narcissistic. This is leaching into the church. And so it's not uncommon now to find Christians whose approach to worship is, this is a platform for me to perform. I like to do this, so I'm going to do it. Now, in the middle of all of this, the great fixed primary point of worship, that this is all about God, is inevitably being neglected and overlooked. And it's our job as pastors to challenge this and to draw people back to that view and that vision of God at the centre of all things. Now, this is very challenging because within this, the failure to acknowledge the centrality of God in worship, I think invariably produces something among us which is more described as worship on the horizontal rather than the vertical. I think when there's a real absence of an emphasis on God and engaging him and meeting with him, we're often very content simply with information and data in the service. And yet it seems very clear from Scripture again and again that within worship we are called not only to the acknowledgement of God as the centre of all things, but we're also called to the experience of God and to know him in that experiential way. Some of the old Puritans used to speak of the Lord's Day as being the market day of the soul. That day when we are refreshed, our stores, if you like, are replenished. There is joy and fellowship. And so this absence of an emphasis, a clear emphasis, initial emphasis, that worship is all about God, ultimately has the effect of disappointing Christians. And I think as well, I'd add, discrediting the gospel in the minds of unbelievers. Came across a fascinating quote from a magazine called First Things. It's a good thing to subscribe to. You can do it for free. They'll send you emails with essays. They're long essays, very thoughtful. It's kind of US political religious comment. There's an essay in there by a guy called Charles Meissner on his friend Albert Einstein. And he makes this fascinating observation about Einstein and organized religion. They're both scientists, and so he's writing about his own discoveries in science and looking at the natural world and basically saying that as you do this, it raises, as he says, religious questions. It's very magnificent, the world in which we live. and shouldn't be taken for granted. In fact, I believe that's why Einstein had so little use for organized religion, although he struck me as basically a very religious man. He must have looked at what the preachers said about God and felt that they were blaspheming. He had seen much more majesty than they had ever imagined, and they were just not talking about the real thing. My guess is he simply felt that religions he had run across did not have a proper respect for the author of the universe. I read that, I felt deeply challenged. The point's been made. Einstein, with all his brilliance and his scientific discovery, was seeing things within general revelation. The heavens declare the glory of God, Psalm 19, that was speaking to him of the majesty and the grandeur of God. But his own experience of organized religion was something rather lame and trite. I was talking to my mother about this the other week. She told me a very interesting story. I didn't realize it happened from the days when they were in Ashford Congregational Church. She said there was a man in the community who was basically thinking about God and thinking that he might go to church. So what he did was, rather than turn up and come into the church was on a crossroads, he worked out what time the service would end, and he stood on the corner of the crossroads to watch the people coming out. And his argument was this, apparently. He did come to faith. The Lord was gracious to him. But his argument was this: I wanted to see their faces. I wanted to see what they looked like when they came out of worshipping. Now, I wonder, that's terribly challenging, isn't it? I don't know about you, I feel terribly uncomfortable with that. If someone stood across the road from the church where I am, I wonder what conclusions they would come to. But I think central to this is that if there is this establishing of the reality of God and the priority of God, and certainly with that experiential emphasis, it should do something to us, which is entirely consistent with what we see announced again and again in Scripture. So how may we support and encourage one another to respond positively to this within the tensions that we face? Well, I think we need to develop a sort of conclusion in our people's minds that Christian worship is unique. It's necessary, it's wonderful, but it's unique. That as we come together on the Lord's Day, we're coming together to do something unique, glorious, and wonderful. In other words, we need to engender a high sense of privilege amongst our people. And we need also to remind them that all the things that we long for in worship are indeed possible because of our confidence in the Spirit of God. So we need to raise the expectation of our people. The other thing I think we need to do is we need to try and teach congregations to partner with us in this. That is to pray and to prepare for worship. Again, I know it's probably a bugbear of mine, and you probably share it as well. The whole idea of how are our people spending a Saturday night? Now, you don't want to be a killjoy, and you don't want to be a legalist, and you don't want to be terribly prescriptive. But it is rather troubling when you see people kind of just waltzing into on a Sunday morning late, and they look like they've been out all night, and there's no sense of anticipation. There should be a sense of anticipation. And instead of berating the congregation about this, I think we need to hold out to people the value, the benefit, and the wonder of congregational worship. And we need to encourage them to partner with us, the need for their prayers and their preparation. And within all of this, we play our own part. We need to make sure that what we bring to people, as much as our energies will allow us and our gifting, we need to bring people to God. We need to present people with God, with his character and his nature and his work. And we must do this in such a way that challenges the darkness and the misery of what they've been dealing with in the past week. We must comfort people directly with gospel convictions. In other words, worship must be a vehicle for affirming faith. Now, I think this requires huge focus from us. It'd be really interesting to pick this up in discussion as to how we move the congregation away from an preoccupation with themselves, what they're getting out of it, what they like, to this central emphasis on God, his person, and his character. It may well mean that we have to take some difficult decisions over the years. So, for example, if we revisit that little church, Mrs. G, who loves to play, hope she loves to pray as well, maybe really it is time for her to step down. And Pastor T, who loves to tell stories and quote from big books, well, he just simply has to pack it in because it really isn't impressive. Deacon B, who loves to crack jokes in the notices, well, you do the notices or find someone sensible. And Mr. D, who loves to look serious, well, we just have to put up with him. And X, Y, and Z, who love to sit where they've always sat, well, you can't change everything, can you? But there are things that sometimes we have to change. We have to challenge directly and indirectly. Because the reality is that as we gather together, as we seek to bring the priority of God to people, the reality is that as we catch fire with that sense of delight and engagement with God, others around us will begin to burn too. But in other words, this has to start with you. Now I want to come to this second area, which I think is neglected, and in some ways a little bit more controversial, which is worship is a spiritual reflex. I used to be a chartered physiotherapist. You know about reflexes. I can do certain things to you which will make you do things you've got no control over, you know. So that's what a reflex is. It's just something that happens. It functions on it's an involuntary movement. It functions on a level below cognition. Worship in many ways is a spiritual reflex. It's a response to the revelation of God. That's why the more there is of Christ and the more there is of God in our services, the more clearly people are pointed to who God is, who Jesus Christ is, and what he has done, the deeper, theoretically, the worship response will be. That's a big challenge, doesn't it, for preaching? If our preaching is really about ourselves and our problems and not about Christ and his majesty, it will have a muting effect on worship. I think it's John Blanchard who once wrote, don't bring God to your problems. Don't bring your problems to God. Bring God to your problems. There's a very different distinctive there and a very helpful one. But within this spiritual reflex, there is a response of the whole person. God has made us emotional people as well as rational and intelligent people as well. Now, clearly the main response to worship is to be seen in our living. Romans 12:1 is very clear. In view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. The great spiritual reflex is the living out of the reality of all that we see in Christ. And similarly, you see a similar pattern in the epistles, don't you? They move from the indicative to the imperative. You know, you look at something like Ephesians, first 3 chapters dealing with objective truth about God and our salvation, and then moving very rapidly to particular specifics. But it's this beginning with God and moving to this, the reality of how we live, that I'm sure fascinates us a lot in our preaching. My question is this: what is it that happens in us that creates that response to live for Christ? If you just take Romans 12. In view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. What is it about viewing God's mercy? What does that do to you? Or should do to us as people, to move us to live as living sacrifices for Jesus Christ? Is it really enough to say, I know not how God's Spirit moves, convincing men of sin? Does the Bible actually give us something more? I think it does. I think an area which is really helpful here is the day of Pentecost. Acts 2, in particular, verse 37. Speaking of the crowd, in response to Peter's preaching, when the people heard this, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the other apostles, brothers, what shall we do? Here I think is a snapshot of how the Spirit of God works through the act of preaching, bringing people to worship, the full worship response. The crowd is listening to the preaching of Christ. It's clearly Spirit-empowered preaching. The subject is Acts 2:22, Jesus of Nazareth, a man accredited by God. The mind is being addressed by Peter. Men of Israel, listen to this. And the target is the conscience, whom you crucified. But when you come to verse 37, you see something quite remarkable. The people heard this. Romans 10:17 is clear. Faith comes through hearing the message. The hearing is vital. But there is something more than just hearing, isn't there? The heart is cut. The will is engaged. Brothers, what shall we do? And the net effect is worship. In verse 41, those who accepted his message were baptized. So it seems that the pattern is Christ is preached, the mind is addressed, but the heart is affected, conviction comes, and the will is engaged. There is a process here. And clearly, within this process, there is the stirring of the conscience. And I think it's fair to say the stirring of the emotions as well. When they heard this, they were cut to the heart and they cry out. I wonder if we think enough about emotions when we think of worship. Now, actually, I think we think a lot about emotions when we think about worship, and generally, in my experience, it's generally pretty negative. You know, we don't want emotionalism. We don't want sentimental preaching. We want the preaching of the Bible. We don't want an approach to worship that merely targets the emotions. And I've heard these things so much, but I'm not sure I've heard very much about the positive side of engaging emotions in the act of preaching. Now, before we look at this, let's ask this very simple question. What are emotions? You can sort of list them all. There's a huge list. You're probably all feeling somewhat different emotions right now. Different contexts, different circumstances, news, whatever will provoke emotions in us. But what is an emotion? I'm doing a bit of reading around on this, and generally it seems from people who look at the way we think and how emotions work in us as human beings, they tend to regard emotions as signs or signposts of what really matters to us. Now, sometimes emotions, they're very much in the moment. You can be watching a sporting event or something like that, and suddenly, you know, you're really engaged and you're really fired up. And, you know, perhaps last year, I don't know, you were watching England-Wales or something like that. It was a dreadful decision by the ref, as there usually is. And, you know, you were engaged. You were up, perhaps you were up out of your seat or something like that. But what was the score? You can't remember. You know, it's emotion in the moment. And you really felt it. And it was true in the moment. And those emotions that you were feeling and expressing were indicative of what was important to you in the moment. It can be very superficial like that. But I'm sure we've all experienced emotions where there has been great, deep, profound consequence. So, for example, seeing the suffering of a loved one. You remember how you felt at that time. And those emotions have lived with you. Emotions are indicators of what really matters to us. And it seems to me, reading around on this, that emotions are important and valuable to us in the area of worship because they are part of the human experience of coming to understand truth, coming to conviction, and the movement of the will. Now, emotions and worship is a real poison chalice. I appreciate that. And I think generally, as I say, we've become very reactionary. And in doing this, I think we've lost something that previous generations were very comfortable with and often looked at. And maybe there's a personal dimension. I said to you yesterday morning, I was preaching in a large apostolic church. I was stood at the front next to my good friend, Arnat, who was very enthusiastic. And I was enjoying singing, and I wanted to be enthusiastic like him, but I just couldn't do it. Okay? And the way you're responding now, I can see that a lot of you can identify that. You know, sitting in Parker Scarlets and watching the Scarlets beat the Ospreys, no problem. But standing at the front of Waterfront Apostolic Church, a very different response. And the reality is that sometimes we struggle with this on a personal level. There can be a veritable simmering cauldron of response within us. to the acknowledgement of who God is, that the exterior is restrained. And I often wonder in my own experience, where is this restraint coming from? And you're wondering, where in the world is he going? Is this restraint a result of my upbringing? It probably is in part. But one of the things that challenges me is that this sense of restraint, is it actually in reality a denial of my humanity? And particularly the expressing of my full humanity in response to the news of Christ. There again, is it a right royal fuss about nothing? Religious feelings were of great interest to Christian thinkers in the past. Few Christians have written more on this, or certainly to the extent that Jonathan Edwards did in The Religious Affections. If you've never read The Religious Affections, I commend that to you. There are newer versions in more up-to-date language, make it a little more accessible, but he wrote at great length on this. Now, for some Christians, Edwards' writings in The Religious Affections rather becomes the beginning of a slippery slope. I was reading an essay recently by Nick Needham on worship through the ages. It's a very, very good essay on the patristic period, the Middle Ages, right up to the Reformation, a little bit more. And then he rounds off the essay by basically saying, well, let's have a look at today. And of course, it's highly critical of what's going on today. And he really puts the blame firmly at Jonathan Edwards' door. Because what he sees in Edwards is an argument not for emotion, as he sees it. He sees it as an argument for subjectivity, which actually I think is really unfair. I want to take you a little bit into Edwards, because I think he's very, very helpful here. He wrote The Religious Affections, 1746, in response to the First Great Awakening, where his desire is to understand the relationship between the intellect, the understanding, emotions, and how the grace of God works. And after all, if you'd lived through the First Great Awakening, you would have questions about this. And so he writes in response to this, and he makes the link between emotions and, critically, action in the Christian life. Acts 2, when they heard this, they were cut to the heart, and they asked, what must we do to be saved? And the net result is conversions and baptisms. Edwards speaks about the emotions, or rather he uses the term affections. I better come clean here. Not everybody thinks that Edwards, when he says affections, is meaning the same thing as we mean by emotions. But I think that's, again, an argument that he's certainly speaking about things that we would recognize as emotions in his use of affections. And he's saying that emotions create inclination and will within the soul. So in other words, for there to be movement in the Christian life, for us to embrace a greater desire to love God more and to serve him with the entirety of our being, for Edwards, the affections had to be engaged. Now, of course, critically, Edwards makes the observation that the affections, the emotions, have to be engaged in response to the truth about who God is and who Jesus Christ is in particular. But he does say some really provocative things. For example, the duty of singing praises to God seems to be appointed wholly, completely, to excite and express religious affections. No other reason can be assigned why we should express ourselves to God in verse rather than prose, and do it with music, only as such is our nature and frame, that these things have a tendency to move our affections. So why do we sing God's praise? He's saying we sing God's praise so that the affections might be moved. Why does this happen? Because this is our nature and frame. His argument is this is what we like as human beings. And the engaging of the emotions in response to the news of who God is and the revelation of all that he's done for us in the gospel is something that Edwards regards as being vital to coming to a full understanding of Christian truth that then moves the will and produces action. And so he says that these affections need to be utilized. We need to use things, in other words, he's saying, that actually engage people with truth on an emotional level. Listen to this. If it be so that true religion lies much in the affections, Hence we may infer that such means are to be desired as have much of a tendency to move the affections. In other words, we need to look positively at things that move and stir the hearts of God's people while the truth of God is being presented. So he says this: such books and such a way of preaching the word and administration of ordinances and such a way of worshipping God in prayer and singing praises is much to be desired, as has a tendency deeply to affect the hearts of those who attend these means. And in fact, he makes this observation that he goes on to say that such a kind of means would formerly have been highly approved of and applauded by the generality of the people of the land as the most excellent and profitable, and having the greatest tendency to promote the ends of the means of grace. Interestingly, at the end of the First Great Awakening, he says this: but the prevailing taste seems of late strangely to be altered. That pathetical manner of praying and preaching, which would formerly have been admired and extolled, and that for this reason, because it had such a tendency to move the affections, now in great multitudes immediately excites disgust and moves no other affections than those of displeasure and contempt. So Edwards is telling us here that the emotional response within us is something that he is arguing should be pursued within the context of congregational worship for the purposes of the bringing home to the soul and to the will of the truth of God and the producing of change. Charles Hodge is another one who's very interesting. Charles Hodge, that crazy, superficial, emotional hothead. Not. He wrote this once: whenever a change occurs in the religious opinions of a community, it is always preceded by a change in their religious feelings. The natural expression of the feelings of true piety is the doctrines of the Bible. As long as those feelings are retained, these doctrines will be retained. But should they be lost, the doctrines are either held for form's sake or rejected according to the circumstances. And if the feelings again be called into life, the doctrines return. There's Hodge telling us, for all his emphasis on theology and doctrine, that there needs to be an emphasis on emotion. Puritans, again, were very strong on this. Richard Sibbes is fascinating as he really looks into the way in which, how do we really understand things as Christians. And Sibbes, like Edwards, wrote a lot about the affections. He regards emotions as crucial to understanding how God brings people to faith. For there to be obedience in the Christian life, and life amongst Christians, he argues a certain mechanism is to be deployed in the soul. The soul must be moved to respond through the senses, or the word that Sibbes uses, the faculties, picking up a lot on kind of Plato's thinking about the soul. What are these faculties? Well, for Sibbes, this is what they were: the imagination, the mind, and the heart. And how does it work? Well, the mind is addressed with the truth of God, but then the imagination is employed. The imagination, he writes, colours divine truth and in turn informs the understanding. He calls the imagination the fancies. People need to be stirred at one level, which by and large I think we're very quick to overlook. Now I wonder how comfortable we are with this, and I wonder what it means for our approaches to worship. I fear that the excellent rediscovery of consecutive expository ministry, preaching, is increasingly producing an information dump on people, rather than that transcendental experience, in its truest sense, the experience of God within the truth. Joseph Hart, wasn't it, wrote that hymn, "True religion is more than notion. Something must be known and felt." And it seems when we make this statement today, we're standing on the shoulders of great Christian thinkers in the past who acknowledge this, and like Edwards, who sought it and sought to provoke it within the context of his preaching in a way in which generally today I think we tend to neglect. So I think things like, what does it mean to preach to the conscience? How do we do that? Preaching to the heart. preaching with the intention of moving people by what they're hearing. I think this could be a very valuable area for our discussion. Well, moving on, the last 2 points are very brief. The whole congregation, in terms of worship involves the whole congregation. I think since the 1960s, without doubt, the social drift in the West has been towards individualism. It's massive in our thinking. It leaks into your church and into mine, you in your small corner, I in mine. You notice how we seem to have lost the plural in a lot of modern, newer Christian songs, many of which are excellent, but you just wish they would say we instead of I. Consumerist performance mindset has crept into the church. And I think this has played really nicely into the deeply destructive power of people setting personal preference over biblical principle. Similarly, it's tended to relegate worshippers more to passengers and consumers rather than participators. So we have to work at maintaining a view about worship, which is that it is both about God and doing one another good. Have you ever had that experience where you turn up to church, you've got to take the service, you're feeling really, really miserable. Maybe you've had a row with your wife, I don't know, or something's gone wrong and your sermon's all over the place and you just feel cold, dry, and spiritually discouraged. I get it, that's how I feel sometimes. And one of the things I've noticed, we have a brief prayer meeting before the service, so a quarter of an hour, 10 to 10, 15. And sometimes I can be sat in that prayer meeting, you hear people coming, and it lifts me. It just lifts me. There's a sense these people have come to worship God. Or there's sometimes it hasn't lifted me and I've gone into the service and you give out the first hymn and you basically struggle through the opening prayer and then you hear the singing of God's praise. I don't know about you, I can go from 0 to 60 in point something of a second. Literally. It's interesting, I have great difficulty crying. Let me tell you this, right? I'll be really honest with you. My father died. I've never cried about it. But I can be singing God's praise and I have to stop. It's the only time it happens. It happens to me in prayer and it happens to me when I'm singing. It touches me deeply and moves me and unleashes me, if you like, emotionally, in a way that nothing else seems to do. We need to be aware that as we worship, we can be a benefit to one another. Daniel Rowlands, the great Welsh preacher, 18th century, people used to walk 80 miles to hear him preach at a weekend after they'd had a tough time in work. And he used to refer to them as he saw the crowds coming to Llangeitho. Here they come, bringing heaven with them. There's a sense where we need to pursue this in worship, that we bring heaven to one another and we encourage one another. So how may we draw people into worship more? One of the things that I've been very encouraged about recently is the importance of public confession, confessing together the things we believe. Now, we've tended to do that by saying Amen and by singing in the hymns. But is there more that we can do? And over the last 12 months or so, we've introduced the Apostles' Creed as part of the service. We've gone through it midweek in the Bible studies. There is something really powerful about God's people standing to affirm together what the gospel is. Not out of any sense of liturgical pressure or traditional duty, but we're doing this together. And what was in my mind was this. A lot of these folks are coming from a week where they've basically been beaten up by the secular world. And as we come together, we need not only to be reminded of what we believe, but we need to affirm it. And it's been a great blessing in the life of the church. I think the way we pray publicly, we need to draw people into congregational prayer. Sometimes you had that experience of hearing somebody lead in prayer, and they basically just prayed as they would have prayed in private, maybe, in their own devotions. Well, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But there is such a thing as leading the congregation in prayer. We need to lead people and encourage people in our praying. Well as encouraging sad Christians by our worship together, and I think that in that sense, the means of grace, it does that. I think congregational worship as well should challenge unbelievers. Say a bit more about that tomorrow. The last thing, very, very briefly then, of course, worship is, of course, for the whole of life. I've quoted from Romans 12. The view of God's mercy is, of course, the previous 11 chapters, which are about the gospel and the grace of God. And Paul then is really saying, well, in the light of all of this, what should the consequence be? And the consequence, of course, is that we must offer our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. Any clear definition of worship must incorporate the whole of Christian living. And there's certainly been a resurgence of emphasis on worship as the whole of life in recent years. If you've read maybe Vaughan Roberts' book, True Worship, came out in 2002. I think it had a big impact here. It was a major contributor to this. And I think in many ways it's been a helpful corrective. There's been a reaction against, the big event, disconnected from the rest of life, the seeker-sensitive approach, maybe the big charismatic event. They were dominant at one time and had weakened the emphasis on worship being the whole of life. But of course, with all correctives, it's important not to swing too much the other way. So worship as a way of life must not soften the value of when you come together as a church, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11. And corporate worship enables us to do things together that we simply cannot do on our own. So what is worship? Well, I've sort of opened up a few things there. I think it is a crucial question because I believe that the answering of this question will take you on a trajectory. And that trajectory will eventually dictate where your practice lands. Okay, well, I'm going to stop there. It's a training session, and so I've emphasised quite a bit on the emotions, really because I think they're neglected by and large in the sort of treatments of worship that I've come across in more conservative circles, and you may want to sort of pick up on some of that.